Morning, year 10. So, just a quick video just to summarise some of the misconceptions that you guys have picked up a little bit from your work last week on ecosystems, interdependence, abiotic and biotic factors. In general, the work across the board has been absolutely fantastic in terms of the notes, the questions answered, some of the exam questions that have been answered and sent to me, and also obviously the review quizzes on Educate that you've done just to demonstrate some of your understanding. The scores have been absolutely excellent on that, but there are a couple of key definitions that I've picked up from your answers on Educate that's worth just watching this couple of minute video to review and just make sure you've got them cemented, because these were errors in some of the questions on the Educate quiz questions. So the first definition, just to be sure of, is interdependence, which is when one or more species depends on another species within the same environment for its survival. So if you look at the slide here, you've got a cow, you've got a tree. They are both dependent upon each other for survival. In that, the cow obviously consumes sugar molecules, breaks them down, and releases carbon dioxide as part of the process of respiration. And the plants need that carbon and take it in via photosynthesis and use it to produce glucose and produce sugar molecules that are then consumed by the plant within the cow within the environment. Without one or the other, so for example, without the cow, the plant, the tree, isn't getting carbon dioxide that it needs for photosynthesis, and without the tree and without the plant, the cow isn't getting the glucose molecules, the sugar it needs for respiration. So that's what we mean by interdependence. In terms of competition, plants and animals, you're really good on animal competition. Plant competition, just one thing I want to remind you of. Obviously, it's less noticeable when you've got plants competing for each other, but you picked up really well that light and water are obviously two of the main things that plants compete for in relation to photosynthesis, and also space, in terms of getting enough space available for receiving light and water for photosynthesis. But the one thing to remember is plants also take up minerals, nitrates and ions from the soil that help them to grow, and they are something that they also compete for. So it's worth remembering that minerals is also something that plants compete for. The definition of a stable community. Now, if you remember with ecology, there's a lot of different key words and vocabulary that you need to be aware of. Ecosystems, communities, populations, individuals, biomes. Now, communities are obviously where different species interact. Now, two definitions that cropped up on the Educate quizzes were about tropical rainforests and woodlands. Now, these are both described as stable communities because within stable communities, the size of the population of the different animals and organisms within that community remain relatively constant over time. They are basically living at an equilibrium, a healthy balance, so that one isn't over-consuming the other. So that's important. Stable communities are where the population sizes remain relatively constant over time. And two examples would be woodland and tropical rainforest. And then finally, just make sure you've got that difference between abiotic and biotic factors. So abiotic and biotic factors are factors that influence ecosystems and the populations of organisms within ecosystems. Now, a biotic factor is a living thing, or a living factor affects the population of an ecosystem, whereas an abiotic factor is a non-living factor that affects the population of an ecosystem. So you've got two lists there. The biotic ones are obviously predominantly organism-based, competition between organisms, predation, and also disease is caused by pathogens, whereas abiotic are often about resources that are being competed for, such as air, water, light, and then conditions within which organisms live. So whether it's windy, whether there's soil, what's the pH like, what's the temperature like, what's the humidity like. So those two definitions are important to remember. So those are just a couple of misconceptions just to review, having done the first bit of ecology work from this term so far.